So today's episode is going to be pretty fun. I'll start with an arts and crafts episode showing you how to make this beautiful creature over here. I call him Mr. Weed because I've made him from weeds that grow in my yard. And I just pull him up. And so I'm going to show you how I created this. And once I am done showing you how to make this, I'm going to go on a crazy rant and inject a bit of emotion into why I adamantly believe that people should not be creating just lawns of grass and why there should be spaces for weeds to grow. And then I'll give you an example of a creature, a cute creature called the woolly bear caterpillar that kind of relies on us not keeping well manicured lawns. And then I'll give you some scientific literature that explains why continuously mowing and having these grass lawns are not good for biodiversity. And from there, I'll finish off having an interview with my most awesomest sister, Shalini Vimal, and she's going to talk about how landscape architects are thinking about maintaining and improving biodiversity by incorporating weeds and indigenous plants into their designs, and sort of how do landscape architects use weeds and still keep beauty and aesthetics. Okay, so the first step in creating a magical creature like this is locating a weed in your yard. And hopefully you have a dedicated location in your yard where you let weeds grow. Because weeds are not trash, they're not waste. Weeds have meaning and purpose in our ecological community. All sorts of creatures and insects rely and depend upon it. And in my yard, I have weeds that grow as tall as a human. I have some weeds that are as tall as two humans stacked on top of each other. It's some of the most amazing stuff. And some of my most favorite, most cherished, most precious moments of my entire life is standing amongst these weeds as they sway and rustle in the wind, as I watch communities of insects go from one to another and be able to be part of that universe. And as late summer comes, they all become pregnant and they release these white parachute seeds that look like snowfall. It's some of the most amazing stuff. So okay, once you have found these weeds, and usually the best time is around now, early spring, where they're dried and dead, the second step is to be able to pull them out. And so here I am, and I'm pulling it out, and you can see that this has a great root system over here. The next step is you take it and you gently just like give it a little massage and get that soil off it. So I have a portion of my yard, and this is just optional, where I lay out these weeds, and the rain, it actually cleans out all of the soil that's stuck inside their hair. But what I also do is I leave it in the sun where there's a lot of sun, and it actually bleaches the wood and the weeds, and I kind of like that. And so the final step is just attaching these eyes onto the weed, and so is born Mr. Weed. Sometimes when I'm driving, I just get so angry. And I get angry because people come up to me and they say, hey, your lawn looks ugly because they're letting weeds grow in it. And these are the same people that have lawns of grass themselves. And the reason why I get angry is that as I drive, I see lawn of grass, I see lawn of grass, I see lawn of grass. As far as the eyes can see, from the East Coast to the West Coast, it doesn't matter if it's a desert ecosystem, people are going to grow grass. And why? Why are they going to dump gallons of water and pesticides and herbicides and insecticides all over their grass? What do they get from all of that? Okay? And some people might say, oh, it's patriotic. That's what Americans do, but they don't. Because the idea of lawn grasses come from aristocrats in Europe. And you know what? I don't believe in the Illuminati. But if I did, this is the exact thing that they would make us do. And you might be like, well, what do the Illuminati get from being able to do this? They get influence because they're able to show, look at these sheeple living over here, creating something that's ridiculous.
We're fundamentally changing the landscape of the United States of America. If you took all of the lawns here and you put them together, it would be the size of Texas. What's the point of it? Now, back in the day when the colonials came here, they did not find any sort of grazing grass on the eastern seaboard. Okay? The reason they brought grass was to feed their livestock. And so if you are a sheep, I get it, raise that grass and eat it. But if you're a sheeple who does not eat that grass, then what's the point? And these sheeple will keep mowing the grass, so that even when the grass could be useful for other creatures when it comes to seed, no longer. Let me ask you one question. If we've got so much grass, where are the grasshoppers? Where are the grasshoppers? Where are they? There are no grasshoppers. Because we're destroying the biodiversity of the United States of America.
Now, some of you might be like, oh, who cares about biodiversity? I hate insects. I wish all of them would die. But, oh, where am I? Well, I'm on my lawn, and here's some leaf litter that I left here all winter long. What could be inside of it? Let's quickly explore. Oh, look at this! Do you see it? Do you see it? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Look at this. This beautiful creature is the woolly bear caterpillar. And could you tell it that, oh, I don't want you in my lawn? What a gorgeous creature. So for the woolly bear caterpillar, I couldn't help myself and I went and looked for a research paper. And the one I'll talk about very quickly is called The Sublethal Effects of Repeated Freezing in the Woolly Bear Caterpillar. Okay, and before I describe what they did, I'll read a passage. To survive freezing, freeze-tolerant insects, such as this woolly bear caterpillar, often synthesize carbohydrate cryoprotectants and antifreeze proteins, which is insane that the woolly bear caterpillar is essentially creating antifreeze to be able to survive these winters. And these antifreeze proteins and cryoprotectant carbohydrates protect cells and inhibit recrystallization. It also says that many species promote ice nucleation at higher temperatures through ice nucleating agents. And maybe someday I'll talk more about this as I read more papers about it. So what these people did is they took one group of caterpillars and they just deep froze them for 35 hours. And they took another group of caterpillars and they froze them for 7 hours, but they did that 5 times. So these caterpillars went through 7-hour freezes and then thaw and then freeze and thaw. And they wanted to see which one was worse. What they also did, which was insane, was they tried to get immunocompromised caterpillar. You might say, how do you get that? Well, they injected fungus into these caterpillars to compromise their immune system. So long story short, as you may imagine, what they found is that repeated cycles of freezing and thawing were pretty bad for these caterpillars. All right, so now Mr. Weed and I are going to go over some scientific literature. And the first paper I'm going to talk about is called Biodiversity in the City, Key Challenges for Urban Green Space Management. And really, I'm just going to zoom down to the end of this paper where they describe 4 things that really decrease the biodiversity in an area. So the first thing is just maintaining lawns of grass. That alone decreases biodiversity significantly. The second thing is removal of habitat. So if, for example, there are a whole bunch of leaves and twigs that are on your lawn and you're like, I want my lawn to look pretty, so I'm going to remove them. Well, if you do that, you're going to reduce the biodiversity. So my first tip for today is that as fall comes and all the deciduous trees lose their leaves, if you're in such a region like Massachusetts, then even though you have the tendency to want to rake all of that, leave a few piles of grass and twigs so that these solitary bees and other beautiful creatures like the woolly bear caterpillar can survive the winter and come back the next spring. And they also say in this paper, as you may expect, pesticides and herbicides are a horrible thing to use because they do decrease the biodiversity significantly. Okay, the second paper I want to talk about is called The Influence of the Reduction of Urban Lawn Mowing on Wild Bee Diversity. So this was done in Germany, and basically what they did, they had one plot of land where they mowed it quite a bit, 12 times in a year, and another one where they mowed it much less, 2 times in a year. And as you may imagine, the one that was mowed less had a whole lot more biodiversity. And again, this includes grasshoppers, as it does with solitary bees and other creatures. Now, the one quotation from here that I found to be particularly powerful is the idea that even if a single mowing event can be reduced, or I should say that a single mowing event can reduce the number of individual wild bees up to 50%. So if you as a lawn person just reduces mowing the lawn once or twice in a season, that could actually have a very profound positive effect. So I'm not even saying don't mow your lawn at all. I'm saying maybe reduce it just a little bit, and that can help the biodiversity. And the final paper is from UMass Amherst. It's a review on bees. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous paper. I recommend you look at it. It's simply written and it's beautifully illustrated with a lot of beautiful pictures of these bees that are indigenous to Massachusetts. They're just gorgeous. Okay, so I'm going to read to you sort of the final paragraph that they have, and they say the following. Most of us like the aesthetics of manicured landscapes, okay? These lawn grasses, who doesn't like that, right? However, this requires the removal of wildflowers and debris that bees utilize. Many of the plants that we consider to be weeds, like dandelions, fall asters, and goldenrods, and actually I had a small video of goldenrods that you had seen, are great resources for native bees. And also patches of bare ground as well as dead trees, wood piles, twigs are nesting habitats for all of these creatures. So try to leave them there. And so the recommendation that UMass Amherst gives is consider allowing some wildflowers and debris to remain around the landscape, and consider allowing wildflowers to grow around the crops before and after bloom if you are a farmer. So that's another nice little tip. Okay, so in this final section, I interview my sister.
My name is Shalini Vimal. I am the sister of Vivekanand, and I am an architect with interests in landscape architecture. I've also worked in landscape architecture offices.
And the question that I began with is that, lawns are really pretty, but they decrease biodiversity. On the other hand, indigenous plants increase biodiversity, but they can look really messy. And so have landscape architects thought about trying to balance grasses with indigenous plants, and also has that vision changed over the years?
I think historically and globally, the concept of the garden, the park, and the landscape has changed much like clothing trends do in fashion. One could argue that landscapes and gardens were driven more by the idea of controlling nature, and as a designer, creating highly manicured, resource-intensive environments that would also serve as a demonstration of wealth and power. Just to give you some examples, in the 16th century, Rajputs and Mughals competed for power and prestige through their elaborate gardens within their opulent forts, like the Mayota Lake in Amer Fort outside of Jaipur, which we just visited when we were on our trip in India. And then, of course, in the 18th century, the European gardens that everyone knows about, like Louis XIV's gardens in Versailles and countless others. So those were really controlled, and they were in some ways just demonstrated the wealth and power of these rulers. The thing about landscape design is that in order for a plant to survive, there has to be some consideration for soil content, topography, solar exposure, annual rainfall, things like that. That even in the examples that I mentioned, I think indigenous plants were always included to some degree as part of the palette, since they are often the most reliable to grow. Nowadays, there's much more of an emphasis on incorporating indigenous plants into design. In my opinion, the age of elaborate, ornamental, resource-intensive landscapes is over, or should be over, as our relationship to water, our necessity for biodiversity and ecological restoration has changed dramatically.
And so my next question was that, are there any real life examples where landscape architects have incorporated weeds and indigenous plants and actually made it look good?
One of my favorite small scale but large impact projects are happening in Los Angeles right now, which is as you know, a sprawling city that rarely sees water. But there still are a surprising number of manicured lawns there. And I've just been reading about it. I don't know like to what degree this is happening, but I've heard that a lot of those lawns are being replaced with drought-tolerant indigenous plants that, in my opinion, are much more beautiful and diverse and interesting than just the flat lawns that you were talking about earlier. And they require a fraction of maintenance costs, water, resources, things like that. The High Line, which we've talked about before, and I'm sure many of your viewers will be familiar with it because it's kind of exploded with publicity. And I do love the project, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's very talked about. But just for those who don't know, it's an abandoned railroad that had just completely grown over with weeds and indigenous plants. And then that was used as the concept to bring it into a public park that's now used by hundreds of thousands of people. And it's a really amazing space that feels both wild and also, you know, curated to some degree. Brooklyn Bridge Park is one of my favorite parks, and there's a great mixture of those two things.
Okay, so my final question was that, are there any tips from landscape architecture that homeowners can use to bring in indigenous plants and weeds into their yards and make it look beautiful instead of like an abandoned lot? And so I'm just going to summarize what my sister said. The first is humans like pretty things. So think about using indigenous wildflowers, such as what you might see in a meadow. The second thing is that humans like order. So try layering, try going from tall to small. Have a tree, and then going from the tree, have an uncontrolled zone of tall wildflowers, and then transition into your manicured lawn. The third idea is that humans like boundaries. So try making a boundary between the meadow-like area that's uncontrolled and your lawn, and that can make it look a lot more presentable. And the final idea is that humans like purpose. So try making a path, like a boardwalk, or like using stones or something that meander through the wilderness area of your yard, or put a chair in the manicured lawn area looking into the meadow.